Every morning for 11 years, 74-year-old Evelyn Hart walked the same loop through Crestwood Park. Same bench by the fountain, same canvas bag with her newspaper and crackers. Same quiet hour she had protected since retiring after 41 years on the federal bench. On this particular morning, she sat down, opened her newspaper, and minded her business. Officer Trent Wallace pulled into the parking lot, spotted a black woman sitting alone, and decided she was suspicious. Within minutes, Evelyn Hart was face down on the pavement of her own park, hands flat, cheek against the concrete, a loaded firearm pointed at her back, arrested for knowing her rights. Crestwood Park in the early morning had a quality of light that Evelyn Hart had never found adequate language for, even after a lifetime of working in rooms where precise language was the only currency that mattered. It came through the elm trees along the east path at a low angle, the way autumn light always came, and it landed on the fountain and the benches and the gravel in a way that made everything look considered, as though the morning had arranged itself deliberately rather than simply arrived. She had been watching it arrive this way for 11 years, and she had not grown tired of it once. She took the east entrance at 7:40, the same time she had taken it since the year she retired, nodding to the man in the gray jacket who ran the same loop every morning with the focused, inward expression of someone running from something rather than toward it. They had never exchanged names. They had exchanged this nod for 11 years, and it was, in its way, one of the more reliable relationships in her current life. He lifted 2 fingers without breaking stride. She acknowledged it with a slight tilt of her head and continued toward the fountain. The bench was the third one on the left side of the central path, set back slightly from the gravel, so that the fountain was visible, but not loud. She had discovered this bench in her first week of walking the park and had made a quiet, private claim on it that had never once been disputed, perhaps because she arrived early enough that the competition was limited, or perhaps because there was something in the way she settled onto it that communicated permanence. She set the canvas bag beside her and took stock of the morning with the unhurried attention she had brought to every new room she had ever entered. The bag held 4 things. The newspaper, folded to the opinion section because she had read the front page over breakfast, and the opinion section required the park, required the specific quality of sitting still without obligation, required the patience that the breakfast table with its accumulated small urgencies did not always provide, the crackers in their wax paper sleeve, the same brand she had bought for 30 years, chosen originally because they were what her mother kept and retained now, out of the specific loyalty people maintain toward the preferences of the dead, the water bottle, and the notebook, small and cloth-covered, the latest in a series that stretched back to her first year on the bench, when a colleague had told her that memory was argument, and argument required evidence, and evidence required the discipline of writing things down while they were still precise. She had filled 41 notebooks in 41 years. This one was half full. She uncapped her pen and wrote the date and the time in the upper right corner of the current page, as she always did, before opening the newspaper. The habit required no thought. It had not required thought for decades. She simply noted the date and the time and the location the way her training had taught her to note them. Because context was the thing that transformed an observation into a record, and a record was the thing that survived when everything else became contested. The opinion section was arguing about judicial oversight, which it frequently was, and she read the lead piece with the specific quality of attention she had developed for arguments she found partially correct and partially incomplete, following the logic where it held, marking the place where it departed from the evidence it claimed to rest on, noting in the margin of her mind the question the writer had not thought to ask. She did not write any of this in the notebook. The notebook was for facts, not analysis. Analysis she had always kept elsewhere. A woman named Dorothy, who had taught secondary school mathematics for 34 years and who walked the park every morning with the slightly distracted air of someone whose mind was still arranging problems, passed the bench at her usual time and raised a hand without stopping. On Tuesdays, they sometimes spoke near the east entrance on the return loop. This was a Wednesday. Dorothy continued past, and Evelyn watched her go with the mild, contented recognition of a person whose world had arranged itself into patterns reliable enough to be appreciated. The fountain ran, the light moved in its slow way through the elms, and a child crossed the far end of the path with a dog that wanted to go faster than the child was willing to go, and the negotiation between them was conducted in the universal language of leash tension and optimism. Evelyn watched it and felt the specific satisfaction of a morning that was asking nothing of her beyond her presence in it. She turned the page of the newspaper. At the periphery of her attention, at the park entrance on the west side, where the gravel path met the parking lot, a patrol car pulled in and stopped. Evelyn did not look up immediately. When she did, she noted the car, the position of it, the time on the face of her watch, and wrote the time in the notebook in the same hand she used for everything, even unhurried, without particular emphasis. 7:53. She looked back at the newspaper. Wallace sat in the patrol car for a moment before he got out. Through the windshield, he could see a woman on the third bench on the left side of the central path. A black woman, older, alone, with a bag beside her and a newspaper open in her lap. He watched her for a moment, the way he watched scenes before he entered them, assessing, categorizing. The report from dispatch had come in 20 minutes earlier. Suspicious person, female, elderly, observed looking into vehicles near the west lot. The description was vague in the way that reports from anonymous callers were frequently vague, which was to say, it described almost anyone, and therefore, almost no one. Wallace looked at the woman on the bench. He had already decided. He got out of the car. His pace across the gravel was faster than the situation required. Evelyn heard him coming before she saw him. Quick, deliberate footsteps that closed the distance with the specific purposefulness of someone who had already determined where they were going and why. She lowered the newspaper. She looked at him with the calm, open attention she brought to everything and waited to understand what was needed. He stopped too close, a foot closer than the distance a conversation requires, which was not an accident. "Ma'am, can I ask what you're doing here this morning?" "Walking," Evelyn said. "So I come every morning." "Anyone with you?" "No." "Where do you live?" She gave her address. She gave it without hesitation, without irritation, with the cooperative specificity of a person who has nothing to conceal and sees no reason to behave as though she does. Wallace wrote nothing down. He was not writing anything down because this had not begun as an information-gathering exercise. It had begun as something else, and the questions were the form it was taking. "Son, I'm going to need to see some ID." Evelyn reached into the canvas bag and produced her wallet and held it out. He took it. He looked at it. He handed it back without comment, and without the shift in expression that the information it contained would later be understood to warrant. He had not read it carefully. He had looked at it the way a person looks at something they have already decided is not relevant. "So I need to take a look in the bag." Evelyn placed the wallet back in the bag and folded her hands in her lap and looked at him with the expression she had worn in 1,000 difficult rooms over 40 years. Not hostile, not afraid, simply present and precise. "Am I being detained?" she said. One sentence, quietly delivered. The specific language of a right being exercised rather than a confrontation being sought. She did not explain it. She did not elaborate. She asked the question that the situation legally required, and she waited. What Wallace heard wasn't the question. What he heard was the refusal. And beneath it, the knowledge that produced it. And beneath that, something he did not have a word for, but which communicated that the woman sitting on this bench had encountered rooms like this one before and had not been diminished by them. And this was the thing he could not accommodate. His hand moved to his holster. I need you to stand up," he said. "Hands where I can see them." Evelyn stood. Her hands were visible. They had always been visible. On the ground, face down. Now. What followed was not fast. Evelyn Hart, 74 years old, lowered herself from the standing position to the pavement of Crestwood Park with the careful, measured movement of a body that understood its own limits and worked within them. One knee, then the other, then forward onto her hands, then flat. The newspaper fell from the bench where she had set it and opened on the gravel beside her. The canvas bag was within arm's reach. Her hands found the pavement and stayed there, flat and open, in plain sight, which was where they had been before the gun came out of the holster and where they remained now. The gun was pointed at her back. She did not speak. She did not move. She lay with her cheek against the pavement of the path she had walked for 11 years, and she understood, and with the complete and terrible clarity of a person who knows exactly what is happening and exactly what it will cost her to respond incorrectly. That stillness was the only available option. The pavement was cold. The cold came through her clothing slowly, and then all at once, her wrists, in the position her arms required, began to ache with the low, persistent complaint of joints asked to hold an unfamiliar angle. She noted the badge number on his uniform. She noted the time on the clock above the west entrance. 8:07. She noted the words he had used since the moment he crossed the gravel toward her bench, assembling them in the order they had arrived, preserving them with the precision she had spent a lifetime developing for exactly this purpose. The transformation of what had occurred into what could be proven to have occurred. She cataloged from the ground, because the ground was where she was, and cataloging was what she knew how to do, and because it was the only form of agency the gun had left her. 20 feet down the path, the man in the gray jacket had stopped running. He stood with his hands at his sides, looking at the scene with the expression of a person who has understood what he is seeing and has not yet understood what to do about it. A woman who had been walking a small dog had pulled the dog back against her leg and stood very still. From the far end of the path, near the east entrance, a man had raised his phone. None of them moved toward her. The gun was the reason, and they all understood the reason even if none of them said so. The handcuffs came after a duration that Evelyn did not measure because she was occupied with other measurements. She did not resist. She said only what the situation required her to say, which was very little. When Wallace reached for the canvas bag, she did not object, and did not draw attention to what the bag contained, because drawing attention to the notebook would have been the wrong decision, and she did not make wrong decisions when right ones were available. The notebook went into the patrol car with her. Wallace did not notice it. She sat in the back seat with her hands in her lap, and she looked through the window at the bench by the fountain and the newspaper open on the gravel, and the man at the far end of the path, still standing with his phone raised, and she did not look away from the park as the car moved because she wanted to see it clearly for as long as it was visible. This place that had been hers every morning for 11 years. And she kept her eyes on it until the entrance passed behind her, and the elm trees, and the fountain, and the bench, and the light through the trees were gone. The processing desk at the 9th District Station was staffed by a booking officer named Carver, who had been with the department for 14 years, and who had developed, across those 14 years, the specific professional composure of a person who has seen enough variation in what comes through a door that very little of it produces a visible reaction. And he was efficient and thorough, and he moved through the intake process with the practiced economy of someone for whom the procedure had long ago become automatic. He took Evelyn's bag. He took her watch. He took the wallet and opened it and removed the contents and placed them in the property tray in the order he always placed them. Cards first, then cash, then identification. He picked up the identification. He read the name. He read the title beneath it. He read the jurisdiction beneath that. He put it down and picked it up again and read it a second time with the specific, careful attention of a man who has learned not to trust his first reading of something that surprises him. The second reading produced the same information as the first. He set the card in the tray with the rest of the contents and did not look at Evelyn and did not say anything and continued the intake process with the same efficiency he brought to everything, which was the correct professional response and which cost him something to maintain. Evelyn sat in the chair beside the desk, with her hands in her lap, and watched the process complete itself. She had sat in a great many chairs over the course of her life, and waited for a great many processes to complete themselves, and she was practiced at the specific quality of patience this required. Not passive, not resigned, but present and attentive. The patience of a person who understands that institutions move at their own pace, and that the correct response to institutional pace is to observe it rather than attempt to alter it. The charge was interference and failure to comply. Carver read it from Wallace's preliminary sheet without inflection. Interference and failure to comply, the language assembled from a form that needed filling, and applied to a woman who had asked one question on a public path and then lain face down on the pavement with her hands flat and visible for the duration of the encounter that followed. Evelyn heard the charge and noted it the way she noted everything, precisely, without editorializing, adding it to the sequence of facts she had been assembling since 7:53 that morning. Carver excused himself at a certain point and walked to the far end of the room, away from the processing area, and made a phone call. He kept his voice low and his back partially turned, and the call lasted 4 minutes. Evelyn watched him without appearing to watch him, the way she had watched witnesses for 40 years, not staring, not performing inattention, simply remaining aware. When he returned to the desk, his composure was intact, and his efficiency was unaltered, and he said nothing about the call, and she asked him nothing about it. In a room she could not see, Wallace was filling out his incident report. He was a man who had filled out incident reports before, many of them, and who had learned through repetition the language that moved through a review process without friction, the phrases that described necessary responses to developing situations, the constructions that placed the subject's behavior prior to the officer's action in the causal sequence of events. He wrote that the subject had made a sudden movement toward her bag at 8:07, prompting him to draw his service weapon for officer safety. He wrote it with the fluency of a man who believed the writing of a thing and the truth of a thing occupied the same category, or who had never been required to understand that they did not. The report took him 20 minutes. He was satisfied with it when he finished. The Bodycam had been recording since he crossed the parking lot. It had recorded the approach and the questioning and the demand and the draw, and the 11 seconds between 8:07 and the moment Evelyn's hands touched the pavement, during which her hands had been in her lap, visible and still. It had recorded all of it with the indifferent completeness of a device that does not distinguish between what a man intends to have captured and what he has actually done. Wallace had not reviewed the footage. It had not occurred to him that reviewing it was necessary. Evelyn was moved to a chair along the wall to wait for the next stage of the process. She sat with the same quality of stillness she had maintained since the park, her hands folded, her attention distributed evenly across the room without settling on anything in particular. The station moved around her with its ordinary business, phones, voices. The specific ambient noise of a building occupied by people managing the continuous administrative consequences of human behavior. The front door opened at 9:41. The man who entered was not in uniform. He wore a gray suit and carried nothing except a credentials case, which he showed to the officer at the front desk before asking, in a voice pitched for the desk and not for the room, to speak with the duty sergeant. The desk officer made a call. A door opened at the far end of the room, and the duty sergeant appeared, and the two men exchanged something brief and then moved together through the door, and it closed behind them. Evelyn watched this from her chair. She did not know what had prompted the call that had prompted the visit. She had not been told, and would not be told for some time. But she recognized what she was seeing with the immediate, unpracticed recognition of a woman who had presided over institutions for 40 years and who understood, as a matter of professional literacy, the specific quality of an institution that has just become aware of the dimensions of its own problem. The shift was not dramatic. It was procedural. A change in the temperature of the room that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. She had seen it from the bench many times. And the moment a case became something larger than the parties had understood it to be, she recognized it from the chair. The Internal Affairs Division of the 9th District occupied the 3rd floor of the municipal building on Alderman Street, and it was there, in a room with 2 monitors and a long table, that Lieutenant Carol Reyes placed the Bodycam footage and Wallace's written report side by side on the morning after the arrest, and began the work of reading one against the other. She had been doing this work for 9 years. She had learned in those 9 years to approach the comparison of footage and report with the specific neutrality of someone who understands that the gap between the two is not always deliberate, that perception under pressure is unreliable, that memory reconstructs rather than records, that an officer in a developing situation does not experience time the way a timestamp does. She brought that neutrality to the table on the morning of the 10th. She did not bring it home with her that evening. So Wallace's report stated that at timestamp 8:14:32, the subject made a sudden movement toward her bag, prompting the officer to draw his service weapon for officer safety. Reyes ran the Bodycam footage to 8:14:32 and stopped it. Evelyn Hart's hands were in her lap, both of them, flat against her thighs, fingers together, visible in the frame with the complete clarity of a camera that had been positioned at chest height and had not moved. She had not reached toward the bag, so she had not shifted her weight. She had not altered her position in any way that a reasonable person or an unreasonable one could have interpreted as a sudden movement toward anything. She was sitting on a bench in a public park with her hands in her lap. Reyes ran the footage forward from 8:14:32. The draw occurred at 8:14:43, 11 seconds after the timestamp Wallace had identified as the moment requiring the draw. Some 11 seconds during which Evelyn's hands remained where they were, and Wallace's hand moved to his holster, and the gun cleared it, and the order to get on the ground was given, and a 74-year-old woman began the process of lowering herself to the pavement. Reyes watched it twice. Then she watched the 11 seconds again, separately, isolated from what preceded, and followed it. And she watched Evelyn's hands in her lap, and she watched Wallace's hand moving, and she sat with what the footage contained for a long moment before she wrote anything down. The gap between 08:14:32 and 08:14:43 was not an error of perception. It was not a difference in how two people experienced the same moment. It was 11 seconds of recorded video in which the event Wallace had described as justification for his action had not occurred. The justification had been written after the fact to describe something that the camera, which had been present for all of it, had not seen. The investigation understood this within the first hour, and the understanding did not become less clear as the hours continued. The complaint file came from records late that afternoon. 7 complaints in 4 years, 3 of them accompanied by supporting statements. 2 of those 3 files incomplete in ways that the filing process did not account for. Reyes moved through them in chronological order and stopped at complaint number 4. Earl Simmons, 68 years old at the time of filing, retired mechanic. The complaint was dated 14 months before Evelyn Hart's arrest, and it described a stop on the central path of Crestwood Park on a Tuesday morning in August, which was the same path and the same approximate hour and the same officer. Earl had been walking to the bus stop after a follow-up appointment at the clinic on Morrison Street. He walked that route every week. He knew the park the way people know the routes their lives require of them. Wallace's report from that stop described the subject as behaving erratically and refusing to comply with lawful commands. Earl's complaint described an officer who had approached him without cause, questioned him in terms he described as aggressive and presumptive, and drawn his service weapon during the course of a pedestrian stop that Earl had not initiated and could not understand the basis for. The weapon had not been holstered, Earl wrote, until he had been on the ground for what he estimated to be several minutes, during which time he had not moved and had not spoken, and had done nothing except wait for whatever was going to happen. Next to happen. The complaint had been reviewed and closed in 3 weeks. No findings. A letter had been sent to Earl's home address, informing him of the closure in the standard language of a determination that had already been made before the letter was drafted. Earl had kept the letter. Not out of hope. He had not expected anything from the letter when it arrived, and had not been surprised by its contents. He had kept it because he had understood, when the closure came back in 3 weeks with its standard language and its absence of findings, that it was the kind of document a person should be able to produce if the question was ever asked again. He kept it in the same drawer where he kept his medical appointments and his utility bills and the other documents that a person accumulates across a life of managing the practical consequences of existing in the world without institutional protection. The question was being asked again. Reyes placed Earl Simmons's complaint beside Wallace's report and the Bodycam footage and looked at the 3 documents together in the specific way she had learned to look at evidence. Not for what each one said individually, but for what they said to each other, for the shape that emerged when they were placed in proximity and allowed to speak. The shape was not ambiguous. The same park path, the same officer, the same weapon drawn without recorded cause, the same department that had received the account and reviewed it and returned a letter and called the matter closed. Earl Simmons had been the pattern before the pattern had a name. It had a name now. The second complaint in the file was filed by a woman named Iris Beaumont, 71 years old, a retired librarian who walked Crestwood Park every morning for her circulation, which her doctor had recommended following a procedure on her left knee the previous spring. She had been stopped by Wallace on a Wednesday in March, 11 months before Evelyn's arrest, near the fountain on the Central Path, while Wallace's report described the subject as acting suspiciously and refusing to provide identification. Iris's complaint described an officer who had demanded she explain her presence in a public park at 7 in the morning, who had taken her library card from her hand without asking, and who had placed his hand on her arm with enough force that she had stumbled on the uneven gravel and caught herself on the back of the nearest bench. She had filed the complaint the following day. She had received a letter 22 days after that, informing her the matter had been reviewed and closed without findings. The third complaint was from a man named George Tatum, 64 years old, who used a cane following a surgery on his right hip and who had been stopped on the East Path on a Monday afternoon in June, 10 months before Evelyn's arrest. Wallace's report described an individual behaving erratically near the park entrance. George's complaint described an officer who had approached him while he was resting on a bench, demanded to know why he was there, and when George had taken longer than Wallace appeared to expect to retrieve his wallet from his jacket pocket, the cane requiring him to hold his balance with one hand while searching with the other, had drawn his weapon and told him to keep his hands visible. George had complied, and he had sat with his hands in his lap and a gun in his peripheral vision for long enough that he had begun to calculate, with the specific arithmetic of a man in an unwanted situation, what his options were and what each of them would cost him. The gun had been holstered without incident. Wallace had taken his information and left. George had filed a complaint 8 days later, after his daughter had asked him 3 times why he was no longer walking in the park, and he had finally told her. His letter had arrived 19 days after the filing, closed without findings. Reyes laid the complaints across the table in the order they had been filed and looked at the dates on the closure letters. 22 days, 19 days, 3 weeks. 3 weeks. The timing varied by days, but not by weeks, and not by the nature of the complaint or the specificity of the account or the presence or absence of supporting statements. The review process had returned its determination within the same narrow window, regardless of what the complaint contained, which meant the window was not determined by the complexity of the review. It was determined by something else. It was determined by the answer that had been decided before the review began, and the review was the interval between the decision and the letter. That finding was not about Wallace. Wallace was the surface of it. See, beneath Wallace was a review process that had received 7 complaints over 4 years, describing a consistent pattern of disproportionate force applied to elderly black residents on the same park corridor by the same officer, and had returned 7 letters in 3 weeks informing those residents that what they had described did not constitute findings. The process had not failed to find the pattern because the pattern was difficult to see. The process had returned its letters in 3 weeks because 3 weeks was how long it took to write a letter, not how long it took to conduct a review. The investigation expanded on a Thursday morning when Reyes brought the full complaint file to the deputy director and placed it on his desk and walked him through the timeline. Not the incident timeline, the institutional timeline. The dates the complaints were filed, and the dates the letters were returned, and the consistency of the interval, and what that consistency indicated about the nature of the review. The deputy director listened without interrupting, which was not his habit, and when she finished, he asked one question. She answered it. He looked at the file for a long moment, and then he picked up his phone. And by the end of that week, the scope of the investigation had been formally expanded to include the department's complaint review procedures for the preceding 4 years. That expansion was not announced. It was documented in an internal memorandum that was distributed to a list of recipients that included, at its end, the department's legal team. The department's legal team read the memorandum on a Friday afternoon and understood immediately what it meant and what it required. So it meant that the body cam footage from Evelyn's arrest would be requested by outside counsel under discovery as a matter of procedural certainty. It meant that the request could not be refused because the footage was material evidence in an active investigation, and refusal was not a legally available position. And it meant that when the footage was produced, as it would be, so on the 11 seconds between timestamp 8:14:32 and the moment the gun cleared the holster would be reviewed by people whose professional function was to find exactly the kind of gap that those 11 seconds contained. The footage would be produced. The gap would be found. The gap contained what it contained. There was nothing in the memorandum that addressed what to do about that. There was nothing to do about it. The record existed, and it was complete, and it was going to be read by people who had been specifically assembled for the purpose of reading it. And the department's legal team sat with that understanding on a Friday afternoon and said very little to each other, because there was very little that was useful to say. Evelyn had given her informal account to the Internal Affairs lieutenant on the day of her release, sitting in a chair across a desk, with her hands folded and her notebook open to the page she had begun in the park. That account had been received and recorded and had become part of the investigative file. What she sat down to write 10 days later, at the desk in the study of her home on Calder Street, was something different. It was her formal statement. There was a distinction, and she understood it precisely, and she intended to honor it. She opened a new document and set the notebook beside the keyboard and began at the beginning, which was 7:40 in the morning and the east entrance of Crestwood Park, and she moved forward from there in the chronological order that the events had occupied, giving each one the space it required, and no more. She did not begin with context or history, or the 11 years she had walked that path. She began with the footsteps she had heard crossing the gravel at a pace that indicated direction and purpose, and she moved from there to the first words Wallace had spoken, and the words she had spoken in response, and she continued in this way through each exchange in the sequence they had occurred, giving times where the notebook provided them, and giving the notebook's exact language where she had written it down. She did not write that Wallace had been aggressive. She wrote what he had said, and how quickly he had closed the distance, and how close he had stopped. She did not write that his demand to search the bag had been unlawful. She wrote that he had demanded to search the bag, and that she had asked whether she was being detained, and that his response had been to place his hand on his holster. She did not characterize, she described. The characterization was available to anyone who read the description, and she trusted the reader to perform it, and because she had spent 40 years trusting that a clean record, honestly constructed, was more persuasive than any argument she could make about what the record meant. The section describing the time on the ground took the longest to write. Not because the facts were complicated. They were not complicated. But because the facts required precision, and precision required care, and she gave them both. She wrote the time she had noted on the clock above the west entrance when the order to get down was given. She wrote the position of her hands before the gun was drawn, and she wrote that this position hadn't changed. She wrote the temperature of the pavement, which was information her body had provided, and which she included because it was factual and because it communicated duration in a way that a time interval alone did not. And she wrote the badge number she had read from Wallace's uniform while she was on the ground. She wrote the charge as it had been read to her at the booking desk: interference, failure to comply. She wrote it all in the same register she had used for 40 years of written rulings. Not cold, but controlled. The specific temperature of a document that trusts its own content. When she reached the end of the sequence, now which was the patrol car moving and the park disappearing behind her through the window, she stopped. She did not add a conclusion. The statement did not require one. She read it through once. She corrected 2 words and 1 punctuation mark. Then she opened a second document and began the request for federal review. This part she knew how to write in her sleep, which did not mean she wrote it carelessly. She identified the applicable oversight mechanism with the statute number and subsection. Thus, she cited the relevant precedent for federal review of municipal complaint processes. She attached the formal statement and the notebook pages that corresponded to the timestamps in the statement and the closure letters from the complaint file that Reyes had provided, which she had read once and set aside, and returned to twice more because the 3-week interval had been the thing that clarified the systemic question in her mind, with the finality of a door being closed. And she wrote the request in 40 minutes. It was the most precisely constructed document she had produced since her retirement, and she knew it was precise because when she read it back, she could not find a word to remove or a claim that exceeded what the attached evidence supported. She had spent 4 chapters, 4 months, knowing what the correct action was, and restraining the instinct to take it before the record was complete enough to make it decisive. The record was complete, but the action was the submission of 2 documents that said what they said and cited what they cited, and required nothing from her beyond the accuracy with which she had constructed them. She printed both, signed the cover letter, and placed everything in an envelope addressed to the Federal Oversight Office on Constitution Avenue. She drove it there herself and handed it to the clerk at the intake desk and received a stamped confirmation copy and put the confirmation copy in her bag and walked back out through the federal building's main entrance into an afternoon that was ordinary in the way that afternoons are ordinary when the significant thing has already been done and what remains is everything else. She did not feel triumphant. She felt the specific tiredness of a person who has completed a necessary thing and understands that necessary things are not final things, that the submission of a document is a beginning and not an end, that the record she had just placed in institutional hands would now move through processes she could observe but not control, and that this was correct, and that trusting it was the last discipline the situation required of her. She walked to her car. She drove home through the ordinary afternoon traffic of a city conducting its ordinary business. She put the kettle on. She stood in her kitchen while it boiled and looked out the window at the garden that needed attention and thought about nothing in particular, which was the specific rest available to a person who has done what needed doing and has not yet been required to do the next thing. She made the tea. She sat down. The house was quiet around her, in the way that houses are quiet when they have been lived in long enough to have absorbed the particular character of their occupant, and the quiet was, for the moment, sufficient. The suspension notice arrived on a Tuesday. It was delivered through the department's standard administrative process, which meant it arrived without ceremony and without the conversation Wallace had been constructing in his mind since the internal affairs officer had appeared at the station 9 days earlier. He read it at his kitchen table and set it down and picked it up and read it again, which was not because the language was unclear, but because he had not yet developed the capacity to receive its contents as final. He called her number that evening at 7:43. He had found it through the department's victim notification system, which was not the system's intended purpose and which he had not considered carefully before using it. The call rang 4 times and went to voicemail, and he did not leave a message because he had not prepared for voicemail and had prepared only for the conversation, for the specific version of it in which she heard him out and understood that the situation had been more complicated than the footage suggested, and that he was not the person the investigation was making him into. He sat with the phone in his hand after the line went to voicemail, and then he set it on the table beside the suspension notice and looked at both of them. In her study on Calder Street, Evelyn noted the call in the notebook. Time. Duration. So number 1. She noted it in the same hand she used for everything and placed the notebook on the desk and went back to the book she had been reading. She did not call her attorney. She understood that a single call from a suspended officer could be characterized as poor judgment. What she was waiting for was something that could not be characterized as poor judgment at all. The second call came 2 days later, at 8 in the evening. Again, she did not answer. Again, he did not leave a message, but she noted it beneath the first entry. Same number, different time, shorter duration, which meant he had ended the call himself rather than waiting for the voicemail prompt. She noted this because it was a fact, and facts were what the notebook was for. A week after the second call, her neighbor Margaret, who lived 3 doors down and who walked her retriever along Calder Street every morning and evening with the reliable punctuality of a person whose dog had strong opinions about schedule, mentioned to Evelyn over the garden fence that she had seen a car parked along the street the previous afternoon, running for what she estimated had been 30 or 40 minutes. Margaret had noticed it because the car had not belonged to anyone on the street and because the man inside it had appeared to be looking at the houses rather than waiting for someone specific to emerge from one of them. She described the car. She described the man, or what she had seen of him through the windshield. She did not know his name, and did not assign significance to what she had seen beyond the mild curiosity of someone reporting a neighborhood anomaly. Evelyn thanked her and went inside, and added the entry to the notebook. Date. Time. Duration, as estimated by Margaret. Description of the vehicle. 3 days after that, Margaret mentioned, with slightly more uncertainty, that the same man had knocked on her door the previous afternoon and identified himself as a police officer conducting a follow-up inquiry. He had asked whether she knew Evelyn Hart and whether she had seen anything unusual in the neighborhood recently. He had mentioned, in a way that Margaret described as almost in passing, that there were ongoing proceedings that might require Ms. Hart's cooperation, and that it would be helpful if she were made aware that the department was simply trying to resolve the matter efficiently. He had left a card with a personal cell number written on the back. Margaret handed Evelyn the card. Evelyn held it by one corner, read both sides, and placed it in the notebook between 2 pages. She thanked Margaret again and said she would handle it and went back inside. She called her attorney that evening, not to report the contacts that would come, but to notify him that the record she had been building was approaching the point at which it would be ready to be read by someone other than herself. He asked how many contacts there had been. She told him. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said she should continue doing exactly what she was doing. She told him she intended to. Wallace believed, across all of it, that he was managing the situation. This was the most precise thing that could be said about him during this period, and it was the thing that made him most dangerous, not to Evelyn, who had understood what he was doing from the first call and had been building the record of it with the same patient accumulation she brought to everything, but to himself. He had spent 6 years operating in an environment where the consequences of his decisions had been absorbed by a review process structured to absorb them, and he had internalized this absorption as evidence that his decisions were sound, rather than evidence that the review process was insufficient. He could not yet believe that the current situation was different in kind rather than degree. He believed that what was required was the right conversation, the right framing, the human contact that would allow the situation to be understood in terms he could manage. He had not yet understood that Evelyn was not a situation to be managed. She was a record being compiled, and the record was nearly complete. On a Thursday evening, 3 weeks after the suspension notice, Evelyn was sitting in the chair by the front window of her study, with a cup of tea and a file she had been reviewing, when a car turned onto Calder Street and slowed as it reached her house and stopped against the curb. She recognized the car. She recognized the man behind the wheel. She set the file on the side table with the same unhurried movement she used for everything. She looked at the car and at Wallace inside it, and at the clock on the mantel, which read 7:21, and she reached for the notebook and wrote the time. Then she picked up her phone. She did not go to the door. She called 911 from the chair by the window, the notebook open on the side table beside her, and when the dispatcher answered, she gave her address in the specific, unhurried way she gave everything, clearly, once, without repetition, and then she described the situation in the order that was most useful to the person receiving it. There was a vehicle parked outside her home. The man inside it was Officer Trent Wallace, badge number 4471, currently under suspension from the 9th District, pending an active internal affairs investigation in which she was the named complainant. His presence at her residence constituted unauthorized contact with a complainant in an active investigation. She had documented 3 prior contacts in the preceding 3 weeks, all of which had been noted in writing at the time they occurred and were available for review. She would like responding officers dispatched to her address. The dispatcher asked her to stay on the line. She said she intended to. Through the window, she watched Wallace get out of the car. He moved with the specific hesitation of a man who had made a decision in the abstract and is now performing it in the concrete, and is finding the concrete more resistant than the abstract had suggested. He stood beside the car for a moment, with his hands in his jacket pockets, and looked at the front of her house, and then he came up the front path. He knocked twice, not loudly. The knock of a person who wants to be heard by the occupant and not by the neighbors, which was a distinction that communicated something about what he understood his situation to be, and how far that understanding still was from what his situation actually was. Evelyn spoke to him through the door. She did not raise her voice. She did not move from where she was standing, which was 3 feet from the door in the front hallway, with the phone in her left hand and the dispatcher still on the line. She said his name and his badge number so that the dispatcher could hear her confirm the identification, and then she told him that responding officers had been contacted and were en route, and that he should remain where he was and wait for them to arrive. Now, she said it in the register she had used for 40 years, when she wanted a room to understand that what she was describing was not a preference, but a sequence of events that had already been set in motion and would complete itself regardless of the response. She did not tell him to leave. Leaving was no longer the outcome the situation required. The situation required him to remain where he was until the responding officers arrived, and she said so. So there was a silence on the other side of the door. Then Wallace said her name. Then he said he just needed 5 minutes, that he could explain. That if she would let him explain, she would understand. That this wasn't what it looked like. That he wasn't trying to cause any problems. That he just needed her to understand the position he was in. She let him finish. Then she said that the responding officers would arrive shortly, and that he should remain where he was. She said it in the same register as before, not louder, not differently. The same words, the same temperature, the same quality of a statement that has already accounted for the response it is receiving and has not been altered by it. The responding unit arrived in 4 minutes. Evelyn heard the car before she saw it, the sound of a vehicle pulling up behind Wallace's on a quiet residential street at 7:26 on a Thursday evening. And then she saw the lights through the window and watched the two officers get out and orient themselves toward the front of her house. They knew his name. She had given it to the dispatcher with the badge number and the suspension flag, and the dispatcher had run it before the car left the lot, which meant the responding officers had arrived on Calder Street already knowing who the man on the front path was and what the notation beside his name currently read. Forward they walked toward the house, and they looked at Wallace, and then they looked past him at the door, and then they looked back at Wallace, and the direction of their attention did not change after that. Wallace understood it before either of them spoke to him. Not from anything Evelyn said or did. From the direction they were facing. From the specific, procedural quality of the way two officers who have been dispatched to an address look at the man who is standing on that address's front path under a current suspension flag. He had come to Calder Street to make something smaller. He had arrived at the correct destination and the wrong conclusion. And the gap between what he had expected this contact to produce and what it had produced was not closable by anything he could say on a front path at 7:26 in the evening, with two responding officers facing him and the dispatcher still on the line inside the house. He had come to make something smaller. He had made it final. Evelyn watched from the window as the responding officers spoke with Wallace in the specific, on a procedural way of people conducting a task rather than having a conversation. She watched him listen. She watched the quality of his listening change as what they were telling him arrived and was understood. She watched him get into the back of the responding unit with the movement of a man whose options have been, one by one, and then all at once, resolved into one. The car left her street at 7:31. She noted the time. She was holding the documentation folder when she had taken it from the desk in the study at some point during the preceding 30 minutes without fully registering the decision to do so, and it was in her hands now. The notebook, the call logs, the entries in chronological order from the first call at 7:43 on the evening of the suspension notice to the entry she had written 10 minutes ago when Wallace's car had turned onto her street. The record was complete. It had the shape that records have when they are complete, not circular, not unresolved, but finished, the way a door is finished when it has been properly closed. She did not feel satisfied. Satisfaction was the feeling of getting what you wanted, and what she had wanted was not to have needed any of this. What she felt was finished, which was different, which was the specific feeling of a thing that had been necessary being over. She set the folder on the side table beside the notebook and looked out at the empty street for a moment, and then she went to put the kettle on, because it was 7:31 on a Thursday evening, and the tea she had started before the car arrived had gone cold, and she saw no reason, the situation having resolved itself, not to have another cup. Wallace was terminated from the department 6 weeks after his arrest. The criminal charges followed: filing a false police report and harassment of a protected witness, 2 counts, filed by the district attorney's office with the specific efficiency of a prosecution that does not require interpretation because the evidence has already interpreted itself. He was convicted on both counts 8 months after that. The state decertification board revoked his license permanently, which meant he could not work in law enforcement in any capacity in any jurisdiction for the remainder of his professional life. He did not return to Crestwood Park. He did not return to the 9th District corridor. The distance between where he had been and where he ended required no commentary from anyone who understood the facts, and the facts were in the record, and the record was complete. That was the floor. What Evelyn built was the ceiling. The Hart Judicial Integrity Initiative held its 6th session on a Wednesday morning in October in the main room of the Crestwood Community Center on Millbrook Avenue, 400 yards from the bench by the fountain. The room held 31 people. 14 of them were police recruits in the 2nd month of their training, and sent by the academy as part of a partnership that had taken 4 months to negotiate, and that Evelyn had negotiated with the same patience and precision she had brought to everything, giving ground where ground could be given, and holding where the initiative's purpose required holding. The remaining 17 were community members, residents of the neighborhood, retirees, 2 social workers, a woman who ran the after-school program at the elementary school on Clement Street, and a man in the back row who had arrived 10 minutes before the session began, taken a folding chair against the wall, and had not spoken to anyone since he sat down. Evelyn stood at the front of the room beside a screen that held 2 images side by side. On the left was a still from the Bodycam footage, timestamp visible in the lower right corner, 8/14/32. On the right was the relevant section of Wallace's written incident report. The line-reading subject made a sudden movement toward her bag, highlighted in the neutral yellow of a document that has been prepared for examination rather than for argument. She did not introduce the images. She did not explain what the timestamp meant, or what the report said, or what the relationship between the 2 documents was. She looked at the room, and she asked what they saw. There was a pause of the kind that occurs in rooms when people are deciding whether their answer is the answer that is wanted, which was the pause she had been waiting for, because it was the pause that meant the room was thinking rather than performing. A recruit in the front row raised his hand. He was young, with the specific attentiveness of someone who had arrived uncertain about what this session was going to require of him, and had spent the preceding 40 minutes becoming less uncertain. He said that the timestamp on the footage and the timestamp in the report were the same, but that what was happening in the footage at that timestamp did not match what the report said was happening. He said it carefully, in the measured language of someone choosing words with more care than he was accustomed to choosing them, and when he finished, he looked at Evelyn to see whether he had said the correct thing. She told him that he had described exactly what was there. She told him that describing exactly what was there was the beginning of everything the record required. She did not praise him beyond that, because the work was not praise, and she was not performing instruction. She was doing it. In the back row, Earl Simmons was watching the screen. He had seen the flyer in the window of the dry cleaner on Morrison Street 3 weeks earlier, the one he passed every Tuesday on the way to his bus stop, and he had stood on the pavement and read it, and then he had taken a photograph of it with his phone, and had thought about it for 2 weeks before he decided that his presence was the least he could do, and possibly the most, and he had come. He had not told anyone he was coming. He had taken his folding chair, and he had watched the session from the back row with the specific, contained attention of a man who filed a complaint 14 months before a letter came back, and who had understood, when the letter arrived, that the letter was the end of it. He was watching the screen. He was watching the timestamp and the highlighted line beside it, and the recruit in the front row who had described exactly what was there. And he was watching a room that had been assembled specifically to see the gap between what an officer writes and what a camera records, a room that had been built in some specific and documentable way, because of what had happened to him on the Central Path on a Tuesday morning in August, and because of what the review process had done with his account of it. And he sat with this without speaking, because there was nothing to say, and because being in the room was sufficient, and because some things do not require language to be understood. The session ended at 10:45. People gathered their things and spoke to each other in the way that people speak after rooms that have asked something of them, and Evelyn answered 3 questions from recruits near the front and 1 from the social worker, and then the room emptied in the gradual way of rooms that have done their work. She walked to Crestwood Park afterward, because the community center was 400 yards from the east entrance, and the morning was the kind of October morning that made the walk easy, the air cool and specific in the way of autumn air that has not yet committed to winter. She took the east entrance at 11:15 and nodded to the man in the gray jacket who was finishing his second loop and who lifted 2 fingers from his side in the greeting that had not changed in 11 years. She continued to the bench by the fountain, the third one on the left, and she sat down and took the canvas bag from her shoulder and set it beside her. She took out the newspaper. She took out the crackers. She took out the water bottle. The notebook was in the bag. She did not take it out. There was nothing to document this morning, The investigation was concluded, and the charges were resolved, and the initiative was 6 sessions old, and doing what it had been built to do, and the park was the park. The fountain running, the light coming through the elms in the low, specific way of autumn light. Our landing on the gravel, and the benches, and the surface of the water, in the particular quality that she had never found adequate language for, and had stopped trying to find language for, because some things are not improved by being described. She opened the newspaper to the opinion section. She read. Her hands were folded around the paper in the way they always held it, the grip adjusted for the slight morning stiffness in her left hand that had been with her for 3 years and that she had learned to accommodate without altering anything essential. The fountain ran. The light moved in its slow way through the trees. A jogger passed on the far path without looking toward the bench, which was the correct behavior for a jogger, and she appreciated it. The park held her the way it had always held her, without ceremony, without acknowledgement, fine with the simple and sufficient dignity of a place that does not require you to explain yourself, because it has known you long enough that explanation is beside the point. She turned the page. Her hands were unhurried. The morning was still. There was nothing that needed to be written down. Trent Wallace will never work in law enforcement again. Was that enough? Drop your answer in the comments. And if this story moved you, hit the like button and subscribe, because Evelyn's story is not the only one. There are more, and every single one of them matters.